Hi.
Hi, welcome back to No Fate, a Terminator podcast. I'm your host, Michael John Petty. With me is Tanner Radwick, who is giggling like a schoolgirl over here. Are we allowed to say that? I don't know if we're allowed to say that anymore.
I don't
Um,
know.
well, we said it. Anyway,
It's
moving on.
probably more so not okay if you're. Yeah, never mind. We're good.
Anyway, uh, welcome back to the show where we talk literally everything Terminator. This week we're talking about the second episode of the Sarah Connor Chronicles television series, which if you have not been watching or not caught up with, what are you doing? Go turn this off right now. Go to Hulu, watch the first two episodes, get caught up so you can watch it with us. We're trying not to talk about spoilers, so you don't have to worry about watching it all at once, although you'll probably want to. Yeah, we're talking about Gnothi Seauton this week, which means know thyself in Greek, if you remember Sarah's opening monologue. Did not know how to pronounce that until today. I've watched the show since high school and always read the title and not been able to comprehend what I just read. So,
Just glaze over it.
yeah. Before we get into this week, there's two things I wanted to mention. If you guys haven't seen the YouTube channel, first of all, if Terminator 2 is one of your all-time favorite movies like us, you have to check out this YouTube channel. It's called T for Two, The Terminator Show. And this guy who calls himself Uncle Casey, which is hilarious, he has taken on the daunting slash exciting task of covering just about everything Terminator 2 related. So he goes like from the initial rumors right after the Terminator is released that there will be a sequel to diving deep into Kenner's action figure catalog to doing a whole episode specifically about the cigar biker who Arnold throws into the kitchen and stabs with the knife and takes his clothes and all that. It's great. It's really great stuff. I've watched a ton of their content and they really do their due diligence as kind of like a history of Terminator 2 and what it was like during the time. There's like amazing production value as well, and they just really do a good job. So check them out. It's T for Two, the Terminator Show on YouTube. We interact with them at T for Two Show on Twitter as well, so you can find them that way. But it's just a really good show. I just wanted to take a minute and plug it because they plugged us on their Twitter feed earlier today, and I wanted to plug them on air so that you guys could take a look at that. It's super good. Tanner, you have not yet had a chance to watch it, but I think you will love it.
I'm going to check it out for sure. Terminator 2 is, of course, both of our fourth favorite movies
Yep.
and our favorite action movie of
Yep.
all time.
All time.
So, that being said, yeah, it's something I'm going to be diving into for sure. I love stuff like that.
Yep. And then the second thing I wanted to talk about, so we were looking at our our downloads on August 9th, which was the day we the day we released our mailbag episode. And we saw that every single episode of ours, episodes 1 through 10, were downloaded that day. So people have been going back and re-listening to our show, which honestly is like super flattering. Except for our eighth episode on Terminator Genesis, because apparently no one could give a crap about what what we have to say about Terminator Genesis or just about that movie in general, which is
Our
hilarious.
da- our downloads reflected the box office perfectly.
So
Well,
obviously you guys couldn't care about the prequel, sequel, reboot either. You just cared about
and to
everything
be
else.
fair, we weren't excited about that episode either.
No,
So,
no, I think we advertised that episode as it being about our least favorite Terminator movie. So, or the worst Terminator movie. So that's fair, you know?
that's fair. But also, I don't know. If you're bored and have a minute, check it out. You can hate on it with us.
I mean, we had some
But
genuinely good conversations about that movie.
we hated on it, but we also did bring up some good points and some interesting points with that movie as well. And I'm sure you guys have some more thoughts on it too. So let us know.
Yeah, keep me emailing in, guys, because we would love to do more mailbag episodes. But if you have like specific thoughts on like specific episodes of the Sarah Connor Chronicles, you can talk about those with us too, and we'll read them on air of that episode when we get to it. So yeah, I think with that we're gonna jump right into our thoughts on Gnothi Seauton, the second episode of the first season of Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles. So Tanner, what were your initial thoughts of this week's episode? It was also directed by David Nutter, just like the pilot was. He's a veteran pilot director for a lot of television series, and he actually did the second episode for this as well, which really does kind of feel like a continuation in some ways of the pilot episode, kind of like a second half to the pilot, since we're now actually in the quote-unquote present. I mean, it's 2007, but what were your thoughts on this week's episode?
Well, I like that you said it's kind of a continuation of the pilot. I like it a lot when shows do that, and it feels like this extended arc to kind of set our characters into motion and kind of round out that experience before they tackle the main issues of what the show has to tackle. One that comes to mind is actually the OC, which shameless plug for that. I got really into that this summer. I tried to get you to watch it, but you wouldn't.
No, I will. I've been busy.
It's good. I never saw it before, and I gave it a shot, and you know what? It's good.
I love that era of TV. I'm here for it.
That show has an awesome arc like that. I think it's like first 3 episodes it rounds out this starting story really well, and this show kind of does that same thing. With this episode, kind of continuing, our characters are displaced into the future by jumping forward, and then they're also trying to figure out who they're going to be in this new future as well, which ties into the title of the show in terms of knowing thyself. So it's a lot of themes of like who they are and who they're going to be moving forward, and trying to set up that identity from there as well.
Yeah. There's a few things I really love about this episode. Just a few like gags almost. And usually they involve Cameron, because Cameron is probably the most socially awkward Terminator. And I think the reason for that is because we spend the most time with her, so we can point it out. But also the fact that she acts so normal the first time John meets her in the pilot, and then never acts normal again.
She doesn't know how to do it anymore.
No.
Yeah.
Immediately breaks character. She's like, acting? What was that?
Yeah.
Which, good for Summer Glau. Like, she really pulls it off as an actress. Like, I love it. Like, I really believe she is an android who is very out of touch with humanity. Well,
she does a great job.
Organism.
That's right. Yeah. No, but one of the best things about it too, I heard, there was a quote from her where she talked about, this is a more advanced model in the sense that she has to portray it as it's more than just a machine, but it's also more than just a girl, and it's somewhere in between. And she can ride that line really well, and she rides that fence, and you can see both sides of it. Where sometimes it's creepy how much she is like a girl, and then other times she's very much machine and is out of place in this world as well.
Yeah. Like when she gets totally demolished by a car and she's like, just please remain calm. And just gets up and walks away.
Yep.
Is it in Terminator 3 that happens to Arnold, or is that Genesis? Or both?
Terminator 3, he gets hit by the fire truck when he's on the crane.
That's right.
But that one he says, I'll drive, and he takes the wheel. So. So.
Yeah, also the amount of times they throw her out of buildings, that kind of becomes a thing on the series where she like just falls a lot, like off of large drops, and I think that's really funny. They've set that up here.
Yeah.
Cameron's great. I really like Cameron, especially the more you get to know her and the more she's just involved. She's unpredictable, she's scary, but she's also kind of caring and emotional in some ways, and we see that like very briefly in her interactions with John.
When we get the biggest part of that as well, when Cameron and Sarah come home from their little mission there, and John of course snuck out, but he's pretending he was home the whole time, and Sarah can know just because she's a mom, she says. Cameron finds out because she grabs John's shoulder, and like as she's walking by, just a quick little comforting grab. And when you watch it, you're like creeped out. Like, why would a Terminator do that? Yeah. And then she gives us a very scientific explanation, talking to Sarah about how his temperature and everything else. She was analyzing him. But you also see a glance from John, like, why did you do that? and he's not used to that kind of affection, especially not from his mom.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden he's getting more affection and more comforting physical touches from this machine than he did from his mom, which was kind of a similar theme too, even in Terminator 2, just in the sense that he was, having this connection with this Terminator, this machine, when his mom was very machine-like towards him in their relationship.
And I would say that Sarah is slowly learning. Like, I think there's elements in the pilot where she's more emotional almost than Linda Hamilton's Sarah Connor. She's more maybe more in touch with her emotions is a better way to describe that. And part of that is probably because it's a few years after T2, so like there's been time to develop that. Also, she didn't just escape a mental institution and was like probably on God knows what drugs, which I think we forget about. But we see that in this episode too, just by her saying, okay, like, I want you to go to school. Like, you need this, and I know you need this, and I care about you. I can't have you, like, freaking out. Also, we just see her struggle with her own fate.
Yeah. Well, and struggle with who she is and what that demands of her. Sometimes we focus so much on what that demands of John that we also miss what she's going through as well. At one point, John is so eager to get this new ID so that he can get out of the house and just be someone new. Yeah. And Sarah says to him, it's not so bad being a Connor. Easy for you to say, John says. Is it? Sarah says.
Yeah.
She's also a Connor, and it's just as bad for her, if not worse in a lot of ways, because she feels like it's on her shoulders to prepare her son for this. So she has a hard time with it, I love it so much throughout the show. You see her ride that line of, like, you get these little tiny glimpses of her wanting to be a mom to John and, like, wanting to show that she cares. You get these mom moments in here combined with just this brutal, like, drill sergeant as well.
Exactly. And what is it that Cameron says to Sarah? She says, in the future, like, the reason I'm sent back here is because you're the only one who can stop this. Like, you are the best warrior in John's mind. You're the greatest soldier. Not anyone in the future, not even Cameron, but her. And that's a lot of pressure to throw on Sarah, which, to be fair, Sarah, of course, threw on John his whole life. So now it's just coming back to her. But still, that's a lot of pressure.
It is.
I really like that Enrique returns. It's a really cool little callback to T2, but I'm not sure how I like his interpretation as a character. I think it's an interesting moral dilemma for Sarah and even for Cameron, but I don't know. It doesn't feel like the Enrique we met. And to be fair, we met him very briefly in T2, but it doesn't feel like that person.
Yeah, you and I talked about this when I first watched the show too. You get this conflict because he's very likable in T2. He's kind of Sarah's ride or die. Yeah. She just shows up. The fed's after her and he doesn't care. He's just there for her. Yep. He gives her the best truck he's got. He gives her all this weapon stash that, she's been putting there and everything. And she doesn't question it. She even bosses him around a little bit on his own property. Yeah. And he goes along with it. So you're like, this guy is legit. This guy is a true believer.
Well, and he feels that way when he first appears in this episode. It's not until the end.
Direction with it.
Yeah, it's not until the end that we find out that he's not El Finito, he's the rat.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting choice that they made there. I mean, they could have even played it that the cousin would rat her out or something like that, but they didn't. They chose to have him be the one to rat her out, which I guess led to an interesting Mexican standoff at the end, in a sense.
Yeah.
When she's holding him at gunpoint, and it was interesting to have Cameron in there and just take him out. And of course that spurs a ton of emotions for Sarah at that point as well. Yeah. So it's an interesting direction to take it, but it also feels a little bit, I don't necessarily wanted to say disrespectful to the character, but kind of.
Yeah.
Just if you're a fan of that character.
Yeah. And again, we don't really get much of him in Terminator 2. But we kind of hear a lot about Enrique throughout this series, like brief little things, as well as Terminator 2, that kind of make us feel like he's supposed to be this good guy. He's supposed to be this true believer guy. He's supposed to be this guy who will always be here for Sarah and by extension John, that he's kind of almost this uncle figure to John. And it's kind of a shame we never even get to see him and John interact in this episode. We don't even get to see them interact now that John is older and not a kid like in T2. Like he's done. And
it's true.
It's kind of a weird thing. I don't know. It's one of the decisions that the show makes that I'm not sure I'm totally behind, but I understand why they did it at the same time. I think it makes for a really interesting dramatic conflict or a moral dilemma, like we were saying, but I'm not sure
it does.
I'm not sure it flows well with the rest of the Terminator universe.
Well, of course, they, especially in this beginning time, you know, it's more powerful in a writing sense to have Sarah very alone and isolated, not having any friends to rely on. Yeah. So I guess the idea that even her close friend, who she could always rely on, is now turning on her and making it easier for the FBI to track down her. You know, you got to give him props at least for taking that stance on it. And it was kind of a bold move. And again, I think you and I, we like that character enough. It's hard for us to fathom him like selling out everything. And he's in a very different environment too. Like you see him in the desert, a trailer. Yeah. And now he's in this very nice home and everything else. Obviously because he's cashing out on, reporting people to the FBI, I would presume. But yeah, it's hard, but it also does give us a good sense of Sarah's very much alone, and she's hunted, and she has no one to rely on. And she's also, the other part, I guess, to talk about in this show is she's frustrated that she's now in the future and doesn't, she's closer to Judgment Day. She brings that up with Cameron. I had all these years to prepare John, and now I don't. But then she learns this bombshell that Cameron drops that, well, you didn't have all those years because you died of cancer. So that's something else to talk about.
Yeah, which kind of reminds me a lot of Terminator 3.
Exactly.
And it's very interesting, the similarities that the writers of the show still wanted to pull from that universe that had already been created, that other timeline post T2. Because what we have to remember, too, is the Sarah Connor Chronicles was the first alternate timeline that we really see in visual Terminator media that isn't a video game. Or maybe even a comic book series. Like Terminator 3 came out in 2000. Oh gosh,
I think it was 3.
I think it was 3.
I think it was 2003.
Yeah, I think so. And the Sarah Connor Chronicles started in 2007, and it wouldn't be until 2009 that we saw another Terminator movie in Terminator Salvation, which follows the Terminator 3 timeline, which actually was near the end of this show's run, which is actually a kind of cool thing. And they got to do a lot of cross-promotion between the show and the film because of that, which is really neat. Mm-hmm. But this is the first time that it's different. And so for them to already take, in the second episode, an element from Terminator 3 and say, this we like, we're keeping this, is really interesting. Because I feel like some of the Terminator films that followed the Sarah Connor Chronicles, like Dark Fate or Genesis, take small things from the Sarah Connor Chronicles, but rarely do we think about anyone taking anything from Terminator 3 and running with it. But John's arc in T3 is very similar to John's arc on this show, and Sarah's death of cancer is very similar to her death of leukemia in Terminator 3, or maybe it's the reverse. So it's just a really interesting thing. What are your thoughts on that, Tanner?
Well, it's as sad and as horrible as it is. It's kind of the perfect metaphor for Sarah's character in terms of the cancer, just being this constant fight that she's having to go through, and also the idea that her time is slowly, draining, and she doesn't have much time, but she has to fight to push through to keep training John, and to make sure that he survives and he's prepared. So I think the metaphor of that was really attractive for the writers of the show. They wanted to keep that element there. As short as it is in T3 when they mention Sarah and her fight through cancer, it's still very powerful. It slows down enough to where John has, this sad moment reflecting on that, talking about how she fought all the way up until after the date of Judgment Day just to make sure that she ended it in T2. Yeah. And just how powerful that is, and just thinking about Sarah's strength and how strong she is in T2, you can see that. You kind of like feel for her in that moment, thinking about that with John, and you can see the tears on his face, making it through that to do that. So that element worked in T2 or T3 rather. So them translating that over to this show, and then you get her paranoia about it and everything else moving forward. It's a good element to actually see it fleshed out as opposed to just having it told to you. Now they get to really work with that because it is
Sure.
interesting, and like thinking about how that would look with Sarah, and also the fact that she kind of hides it from John too,
Yeah.
and like has this other thing that she has to deal with herself.
I think something else that's really interesting to consider what the writers are doing here, and they're doing it without like overtly shoving it down your throat, is they're skipping over the events of Terminator 3.
Yeah.
They're saying John's arc is similar regardless of if his mom is here or not, but we're literally going to jump the timeline over those events, retcon them, and still use them to have some sort of impact. And it kind of reminds me of what Star Trek did, that J.J. Abrams did with Star Trek in his first Star Trek movie, which also came out in 2009, where in that movie, and this might be a spoiler for those of you who haven't seen it, so I apologize in advance, but in that movie, the very opening scene is immediately retconned when Romulans from the far future, far beyond the original Star Trek series, arrive and change events, changing, James Kirk's birth and origin story, and changing Spock, and changing all these characters to the point where Spock from the original timeline actually also comes back to the past and encounters Kirk and Spock, young Spock, and explains to them that my timeline is gone, but this timeline is now like taking its place, in a sense that he's now in this alternate bridge from where he came from. And it's kind of doing the same thing here. Terminator is kind of doing the same thing here. And I just think that's really cool from a science fiction standpoint, if we're talking about timelines and time jumps and all this stuff that we'll get into a lot more on this show, because there's a lot more convoluted stuff when it comes to that. But it's just a cool thing.
Well, on that same note, too, I mean, there's a lot of storylines packed in this episode, but just this also introduces the idea that it's not only Cameron who came back, but also these other Terminators and these other resistance fighters of all things.
Yep.
And the idea that they can also send back these groups to have these safe houses and prepare the money stashes and these, weapon caches.
Or the
things
bank
like
with
that.
the time device.
Yep.
Yeah.
All this prep work and everything else, it makes you stop and think. Like back to Terminator 1, Kyle talks about how they found the time displacement machine. They send the Terminator back, they send Kyle back, and then he says they destroy it, kind of thing. And no one else comes through, and that's it. But then you start thinking about, wait, but that is like a really good resource. If the future war is going to be fought in the present, you kind of need to keep sending people back there. It's, of course, this crazy paradox that it's fascinating, but it works. And this show getting to explore more of that, whereas the movies are just kind of a one-off, we'll throw a couple back there and that's it kind of thing. But it's really fun thinking about the idea of all these different things coming through. And I guess I should give Dark Fate some credit, too, because they played with that, too.
Yeah.
But, yeah, this other storyline of talking about these resistant fighters coming back, it's great, and it preps the future of the show so well for all the different possibilities that can come from it.
Well, and I think to your point, that's something that I thought was really interesting about Dark Fate that kind of makes me upset we didn't get to explore that world in another film, because, that the Carl Terminator, Arnold's character in that movie, he mentions that he gets the locations of Terminators when they show up from the future, and he gets them from an unknown number, which we assume is some sort of resistance fighter in the future, either in the future or someone who came back to the past with that knowledge. And that's just a really interesting concept that they play with in that movie that obviously it seems like was inspired by this show, which makes sense when you realize that Josh Friedman, the creator of this show, actually has a story credit on that movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea that Skynet and the Resistance both have their own time machines at this point. The Resistance probably recreated one based on the schematics of Skynet's, because I'm sure Skynet built more than one, obviously. And as the war continued on, I'm sure over time it started becoming a war for the past and stopped being a war for the present. They probably destroyed Earth enough that, it just made more sense to fight it in the past. So it's really interesting. We also realize, like you were saying, that they are sending other Terminators back too. So we have Cromartie, who's our main Terminator, who is now getting his head back in this episode, which is gruesome and terrifying all at the same time. But then we have this other Terminator that has killed 3 of the 4 Resistance fighters, who's running around now too. So we know of 2 so far that are around, which is kind of terrifying when you think about it, because in the films, there's only ever really 1 at any time.
And the idea that they can look like anything now at this point too.
Yeah, they don't have to look like Arnold or whoever,
you know. They don't have to look like Arnold. Yeah. It's creepy. And the idea that they're acting kind of independently of each other as well, and like have their own motives and like missions. And even the way it like analyzes Cameron seeing an unknown cyborg, and it just thinks it should evade at that time.
Yeah.
Just the foreknowledge of it and like the planning of it, and the way it kind of like sets a trap up there. It's scary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to think that all these things are out there running their own show, kind of independent of each other.
Yeah. Super cool. It also kind of makes you wonder, does Skynet have this overall plan for the past, or is it just continually sending things back to take out Resistance fighters? Or is it trying to make sure that it is born a certain way? I don't know. It's kind of interesting to think about, because Genesis kind of plays with that idea that Skynet would send someone back to make sure it was born. But before that, it was just this show that kind of had this possible explanation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and even Terminator 1 too, just in the sense that, I mean, Terminator 1, it seems like an unplanned creation, but
Sure.
Skynet does get created because Skynet sends back the first Terminator to kill Sarah, which ends up being found in the factory and everything else to advance our technology. But, yeah, the idea that it would send something back to actively create Skynet is cool. And I guess they did do that. Did they do that in Genesis? I'm already forgetting that movie again.
Yeah, because John is the T-3000, and he's sent back to oversee Genesis becoming Skynet, remember?
Well, if we talk about Genesis too much on this episode, they're not going to download it. So I guess we should not mention it too much.
Speaking of Genesis, another thing that... No, I mean, and it does. It kind of reminds me of this movie a little bit. John exploring the modern world and seeing all these new things, like cameras on computers and cell phones and these laptops with endless access to the internet that he didn't have in the 90s and all that. It reminds me a lot of this idea of them jumping from the 80s to the 2010s in Terminator Genesis.
Yeah.
And just kind of not knowing what is going on and not knowing what anything is. And Genesis is a app? What? And it just kind of reminds me, like, obviously they pulled that from this show, because that's exactly what John goes through in this episode when he's like looking up Charlie and looking up himself and his mom and the fact that they're supposed to be dead. And it's just really interesting to see John interact with this world that he just doesn't know. And John has always kind of kept up with technology. I think part out of fear and part out of curiosity. And here, of course, he's more curious than anything else, but he leaves and freaks out of fear, out of this instinct of, oh crap, I can be tracked, I can be found, I need to get out. And it's really cool. It's really interesting, and I like it a lot. Normally, we don't see people traveling from the recent past to the present, you know, and seeing how much things have changed in such a short time, but that's an idea I really like here. You know, Back to the Future, he travels 30 years in the future. And so, of course, everything's different. That makes sense. But it's just very interesting.
Yeah. No, I like that part a lot. And it's funny seeing him, like, he's comfortable enough to jump right on the computer and, like, figure it out for the most part. But he's also out of his element in the sense, which is odd for him, because usually he's so in tune with technology and where it is. And he loves his hacking and everything else. So to see him jump in and then just all of a sudden have a panic attack as he realizes, oh my gosh, this is stupid, I need to get off of here. He books it out of there. No, it's a great moment. And I'm trying to think of other spots in the show where they do that. We'll have to spot them as we move forward. Trying to remember if there's any other trends that change. Oh, well, I guess Sarah learning about 9/11 is another.
Oh, I wanted to talk about that. That's crazy. Could you imagine?
Yeah. No. Yeah. It's scary, and it's wild with her little dialogue about it as well, because it ties into her talking about she knows the atrocities that are going to come from the future Holocaust,
Right.
the nuclear fallout and everything. But for her to learn about this attack and these other deaths and whatnot, you see her upset just thinking about these human lives who are gone.
Well, and she says,
So it's interesting that they threw it in there.
yeah. Well, and she says too that if she had been here, she would have thought it was the end. That she would have thought the machines were about to take over. That it was all going to hell, and that it was like over basically. And I think that's a really interesting outlook, because it reminds me, and this, for our listeners who do not identify this way, excuse me, but it kind of reminds me of Christianity in a sense, where people know from something like the Book of Revelation how things are going to play out, but then you see modern events and you're like, well, it has to correlate because it feels like this. It kind of reminds me of that, like these people who start doomsday communes and cults and are like, well, because of this, it must mean that the end of the world is coming and it's going to be on this date. And that must be how Sarah feels in some sense, like kind of like a crazy cult leader.
Yeah. Well, I mean, she's seeing it as another sign of a coming collapse, and it's probably making it all seem real again for her too. Just another glimpse of destruction in this world. And that's kind of a foreshadow of what's coming in her mind as well.
I think that's about it as far as what I had in my notes, Tanner. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about Gnothi, Seauton before we head out?
I really like the part where we don't see it happen, but Cameron comes in holding a diamond.
Yeah. That
she says John gave her. And Sarah's has this trying to think about what her emotion is in that moment. She's she almost chuckles about it a little bit, but she's also uncomfortable at the idea of what is John's intention in giving her this diamond kind of thing.
Yeah.
Cameron saying John gave it to me and asking her if Sarah wants one. Diamonds are a girl's best friend.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining.
Not this girl, Sarah says. Yeah. And of course, Sarah was given a diamond in the beginning of this show.
Yeah.
And
that's an interesting callback. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Sarah says, not this girl.
Not this girl. We do get to see Charlie also very briefly.
Yeah.
John goes to visit him and then freaks out in the moment and hits him and runs away. I'm sorry, John. How did you think this was going to go? What? Don't get any closer. It's what are you going to do? Kill him? I don't understand.
It's a really good portrayal, though, of how that would look, I think.
Yeah.
Charlie enters and he sees a blur go into the other room, and you see him panicked at first, oh my God, someone's in my house. But then you slowly see him wait, John?
Yeah.
And just, I don't know. I really like the interaction between them. It feels really real and genuine, and you feel like Charlie has a real love for John, and John has a real love for Charlie. And they're put in this situation where John wants to be there. He knows he can't be, though.
Yeah.
And it's just a really interesting little interaction. You said your wife couldn't handle that part. She had to leave. I think mine had the same reaction.
Yeah, she was stressed.
That.
She's like, tell me when it's over. And I made her come back and sit down and watch.
That's what I have to do with mine, too. Just watch it. It's like the, what is that movie with Sandra Bullock where you make the eyes open? Is it Bird Box? What the heck was it?
Yeah, Bird Box.
Birdcage?
Bird Box.
Bird Box? Yeah. I have to do that to my wife. No, watch it. And I open her eyes.
Maybe that's what I'll have to do next week if there's another stressful scene.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so funny.
No, those are two really fun little scenes. There's a lot in this episode. There's a lot of little... I mean, they're still prepping kind of where the show is going and introducing all these different elements. So kind of a continuation of the pilot. We'll see how much episode 3 does of that as well. I don't remember, honestly, so I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, honestly, it's been probably since around the time I first recommended the show to you, if not longer, that I've seen this show. So it's almost like I'm watching it again for the first time, which is really great. I actually really appreciate that.
Oh, yeah. It's all fresh again, and we get to look at it under the context of, dissecting a little bit more. So hopefully when our listeners watch it too, they can start thinking about that, and we'd love to get more questions about your thoughts on the show.
So with that, guys, we're going to take off Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. Go back and listen to some of our previous episodes on the films if you haven't already. If you're just here for the Sarah Connor Chronicles, well, thanks for coming. We really appreciate you being here. This is kind of the reason we started the podcast, is we wanted to talk about this show specifically, as well as Terminator 2, which again is our 4th favorite film of all time. So I'm sure as our show continues, we'll talk more about both. But yeah, next week we'll be discussing the 3rd episode of season 1 of the Sarah Connor Chronicles. But until then, you can find us on Twitter at NoFatePod. You can find our website, nofatepodcast.com, and interact with us through there. Send us an email, send us a tweet. We'd love to engage with you. We'd love to read your thoughts on either this show or one of the movies on our show. We'll probably do a mailbag episode again by the end of this season. Yeah, we're just really excited to be here, and we're really excited for you guys to be on the ride along with us. So find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We have an RSS feed. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts if you want to see us continue, because we don't get paid for this. We do this just because we love Terminator so much and because we appreciate you guys. So whenever we get positive feedback, it really encourages us to keep going. So with that, Tanner, I think it's time to sign off.
Yeah, it was a good episode. We'll talk more next week.
Absolutely. But until then, guys, remember, you are the Resistance.